Today we have Mike Paddock to talk to us. He's an alumnus of our program, and he's done extensive work overseas, and he's going to tell us about the day. So thanks, Mike, and go ahead when you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today, and look forward to this presentation. Just a little bit of nostalgia from 1988. There's a picture of my wife and I when we graduated from Michigan Tech. And of course, as all Tech students, participated in Winter Carnival. With pride, I can say that our team won the one-nighter competition 4 years in a row up in Daniel Heights. So certainly missed those days at Michigan Tech, and especially right now, because I have to say that fall was always my favorite time up at the Tech. Michigan Tech was really key for me to get started in my service engineering work. About 23 years ago, I guess, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And at that point in time, I was actually didn't think that I was going to still be with you like I am today. And after realizing that I was still going to be on this planet, came to the realization and determination with my wife that we would use that gift to give back to others around the planet. And it was about that same time that I picked up an alumni magazine and I read about Michigan Tech's brand new program in Bolivia, where the civil engineering department was doing senior design. So I sent a note to Professor Phillips at the time and just told her about how amazing I thought that program was, and if she ever needed a hand to let me know. And of course, the next thing you know, I was on a flight down to Bolivia. And frankly, that was start of an amazing whirlwind program, as well as a life that I've continued to this point. Just a quick note about Engineers Without Borders. It's an organization, and of course there is a chapter up at MTU. It works to build a better world through engineering projects that empower communities to meet their basic human needs and equip leaders to solve the world's most pressing challenges. And Michigan Tech has had a chapter since the very beginning of Engineers Without Borders, and I'm really proud of that. You know, it's kind of ironic that 2020 is the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, right? You're in the middle of a pandemic. It's pretty amazing. And the reason for that is that this is the 200th birthday of Florence Nightingale. And of course, Florence Nightingale is the founder of modern nursing. And I love this quote by Florence. I attribute my success to this. I never gave or took any excuses. I think that level of credibility is really important in everything we do, but especially in service engineering. This particular case study and story really goes back to these healthcare workers. On the right is Gavina, and on the left is her friend Josefa. And both of these ladies are midwives. Midwives are on the front line of a community's healthcare system. They not only deliver babies, but treat everything from a machete cut to COVID-19. They're really almost like a physician's assistant, except yes, these ladies still do house calls. What's interesting to me is in many places that have indigenous societies, these ladies believe that they're called by God for this particular task and duty. And I can tell you that they know how to do this job. They're really professionals. They know the barriers to accomplishing their work, and they know how important their work is. And in this particular case, the barriers were access to a hospital and clean water. You see, the hospital their path to the hospital was blocked by the Rio Motagua, which is nicknamed the Assassin, due to the number of deaths caused by those who attempted to swim its raging current. You know, I remember the first time I met Gavina, and she was explaining to me that she would visit an expectant mother. She would feel the fetus and the baby, and she knew trouble was ahead, right? She knew that the baby was turned wrong and the mother really needed a C-section. But there was no way for her to get the mother to the hospital. So all she could do is trudge back up to her house and say a little prayer and hope for the best. Her other challenge was that the community lacked clean water. This caused infections in the newborns as well as those mothers. Not to mention, it endangered both Gavina and Josefa in their daily work. You see, at this time, 2 to 3 babies were dying each year during childbirth. And one mother, and you have to remember this mother would be a friend or a neighbor to these ladies, was passing due to this lack of access to clean water and a hospital. Sadly, these communities are not alone. Even today, 2 billion people on the face of this planet lack access to a healthcare facility with adequate water and sanitation. As an engineer, I find that absolutely appalling and frankly, a call to action. This story also is about my mentor, Don Mike. And I have to say, he's really a character beyond all characters. You see, when he got out of college, he's a Brit, he decided he was going to hitchhike all the way from London to China on 20 pounds. After he got done with that amazing adventure, he went to the Northwest Territories of Canada, where he explored caves. And he told me that he was amazed that the Canadian government would pay him for that work because he loved everything about exploring caves and mapping them. And it's this love of caving that brought him to Guatemala to explore caves. But once he met the people, it's the love affair that he had with them that kept him there. He just absolutely loved to work with the Mayan people and their commitment to improving their lives. And for 40 years, he worked doing community development. And I was just so lucky that he shared his lessons learned and experiences with me. In the book that I wrote, I do my very best to share these lessons learned with the reader and a few fun stories about Don Mike along the way. You see, before I met Don Mike, I thought I knew the answers to community development. And then I realized I didn't even know the questions. Let me see here. I think I might be missing one slide. I'm going to go to the next slide. Great. So here we go. One of the things that I learned early on is that you need to design your work to be in harmony with the geographic setting. You know, a wise person once told me, you can fight Mother Nature, but you better have a lot of time and a lot of money. In this particular setting was pretty challenging from one particular aspect. This is the fault location of the continental plates of the North American plate to the north and the Caribbean plate to the south. And of course, this causes a couple of unique challenges to the development of any project here. One is obviously the earthquakes. In 1976, there was a massive earthquake that rocked the region that 100,000 people lost their lives and 1.2 million people had lost their housing. But in addition to that, when the southern plate gets pushed underneath the northern plate, it causes incredible difficulty to find groundwater to the north of this fault. And so groundwater sources are extremely scarce and difficult to achieve. And this provides a challenge for anyone trying to get potable water in this region. The other important thing that I learned is that it's important to understand the context of the community. You see, Guatemala had a history of violence and particularly discrimination against the Mayans going back to the conquistadors, and had experienced a 30-year war from 1966 to 1996 that was quite brutal in nature. And I realized that it's very important to understand the context of your project, and fully do your best to understand the challenges. This particular, the translation of this sign is, they can cut our trunk, they can cut our branches, they can take our fruit, but they cannot take our roots. And you can see that this, this feeling was pretty prevalent among the Mayan peoples even to this day. And this is something that I took forward in my daily work, which was as a civil engineer for CH2M in the Milwaukee area, working on freeways. And it was so important to understand the historical context of where the freeways ran through the communities, separating underprivileged communities, and how they felt about that as we went back and were doing those freeway improvements. The community that we worked in, La Garrucha, was not spared this violence. And you can see there were 47 people that were killed in massacres during that time. And they ranged all the way from 70-year-old grandfathers to 8-year-old children. So the impact on the community was significant. I'm going to just quickly go back up. So one of the things that I learned from Don Mike was how to receive a solicitation. It's just so important that the idea and the impetus for change come from the community itself, not from the outside. I learned that it's important because you cannot help anyone who does not want to be helped. And so this particular photo shows a picture of one of 23 pages in the solicitation packet. And these are thumbprints from the head of household from each family, showing their support for the particular project. You know, it's just so important that you do the right project for the right people at the right time. And unfortunately, many of our lives, donors as well as implementers, our schedules don't match with that. And I think that frankly is one of the reasons why we see such challenges in sustainable development. As the story goes, when this packet was presented to Don Mike at his favorite restaurant, of course he promised all he could, which is that he would be able to go and do an assessment, and then based upon that, make a decision if the project would move forward. And the community then presented him with a live turkey in front of the restaurant, which was quite the disturbance. And after they left, of course, Don Mike gave the turkey to his favorite waitress, because being a bachelor, he had absolutely no idea how to prepare the bird. At this time that Don Mike had reached out to Engineers Without Borders, and Engineers Without Borders has student teams, and this particular team was assigned from Marquette University to work on the program. And it was a good fit because these students, Marquette's motto is to be the difference. And they were really committed to be the difference for this community to break through the barriers that were holding it back. The project to build the bridge started out with a major surprise. As Don Mike would say, be prepared, this is Guatemala, anything can happen. During the excavation for the footings, it started to rain and the wind started to blow, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And frankly, I was getting pretty upset because I was wondering, you know, we were behind schedule, and I was wondering when things were going to end. And then I realized finally, when one of the community members came and visited us, that this storm had a name. It was Hurricane Stan. And you see, we didn't have any cell phones or any other communication down there at that time. And so it was then that we learned that the devastation across the country was over 1,500 people had lost their lives during this storm event. That required us to really pivot on the fly from being developers to disaster responders. You know, one of the lessons learned is that development is all about sustainability. you need to take the time to work with the community and find out sustainable solutions. But disasters are all about speed. It's about delivering life-saving activities to the people in need, and ultimately, as Don Mike would say, a race against cholera. It's during this time that we work to restore drinking water systems and vital transportation links so relief supplies and workers could flow. I learned how to triage infrastructure and use what tools and materials were available, like this photo, where we're building bridges out of the debris that was available. This particular photo shows the initial part of the work right after the groundbreaking. And it occurred 4 months after the disaster. We were building a temporary pier in the middle of the river to support some false work for the bridge construction. But I think the most important part of this activity was that we all had to work together. You see, we had 14 communities involved in the project, 7 to the south and 7 to the north. And the people spoke different languages. One spoke Quechua and the other spoke Quiche Mayan. And it was nothing like working together, passing heavy stones to each other, trusting that your neighbor wasn't going to drop that stone on your foot, to build some sense of trust between these different work teams. It also was incredibly visual as we saw this pile of rock rise up in the middle of the stream. And it was pretty impressive, and it happened relatively quickly. So I think when we completed this particular task, everybody finally believed that yes, indeed, we could really do this project. Now the bridge would be a vehicle bridge, and it's a cast in place concrete structure with beams. And the trick here is how to hold up the concrete falsework so that the concrete sets, the formwork, if you will. And so we designed wooden trusses that would span and hold the concrete until it's set up. And you can see that each truss would be placed one on each side of the beam and form a beam pocket for the concrete to be placed in. Relatively simple design. Each connection needed to be designed, and then you realize that we had to work within the limitations of our materials and processes. You see that our wood was cut literally right on site using a chainsaw. So that meant variable dimensions. Of course, no graded lumber here. We had to do our own grading. But each of those connections was difficult because it had to be made with the connectors that we had available, primarily nails. So that would be each connection had to have a separate nailing pattern to be able to make sure that it had sufficient force to withstand the loads. And then finally, the beams had to be, the trusses had to be constructed on the side of the mountain, and a camber dialed into the system so that the dead load would flatten out the truss as it was loaded with the fresh concrete. Now, this is a challenge for us even in a shop here in the United States. So you can imagine the head scratching that had to go on the side of a mountain with a variable work team. As you see, different workers would show up from each community each and every day. So we had to go through the process of retraining people on a regular basis. And of course, this needed to be repeated 24 times for each truss. Finally, after the trusses were completed, we were able to then move them out onto the bridge deck and place them. And again, no cranes here. So everything had to be done using human power. And it's at this point that I really also learned how to listen to the community. You see, the local people knew how to leverage manpower and do amazing things, much more than us Americans did. So a lot of listening on how to use large work crews, levers, and ropes to do what we would typically do with a large tool, like maybe a crane. The next step, we had tied the rebar cages on the side and then moved them into place. But again, no cranes were available. So you can see these were moved into place using human labor. So literally 100 people, up to 100 people at a time would be moving these large rebar cages into place as they walked them out onto the bridge deck. Now this particular photo is one of my favorites. And it's because I think everybody sees something a little different here. The engineers might see the 3 concrete mixers that are working simultaneously to be able to provide the concrete out onto the bridge deck. Others might see the endless loop of wheelbarrow chains delivering the concrete out to the end of the pour. And then my wife will point out the 2 young ladies hustling across the temporary bridge with baskets of tortillas on their heads, because we all know that every work team works on its stomach. It's just fascinating to me. One picture says so many things differently to so many different folks. But of course, after the bridge was built, Gavina reminded us our job was not done. We still had the potable water system to build. And this is a graphic that shows what that would look like. There was a spring located down in the lower left, represented by the star, and the water would flow by gravity to a tank represented by the square, and then from the tank through a distribution network to each of the homes. Relatively straightforward system, but required about 20 miles of piping. This is a better representation of what that challenge would look like. This is about a 4-mile stretch of that pipeline, and you can see that it goes up and over mountain ridges, down through valleys, across forests, and crosses streams. And then you realize that this trench needed to be dug by hand. For an entire summer, work teams of over 100 people would come out and attack their task. Each person would be assigned a 30-foot stretch of trench to dig. And if you were lucky, it would be nice, soft soil. If you were unlucky, you might need to dig through rocks or possibly roots or even a stump. The amount of work was incredible to be able to make this excavation 30 inches deep. Now, I know the people in this photo may not look happy to you as they pose in the traditional Guatemala manner of not smiling, but trust me, they're ecstatic. I've had the privilege to be able to turn on water systems a couple of dozen times in my career, and I never tire of it. You know, you turn on the spigot at the distribution tank and the water flows by gravity down to the first house. And you hear the family shriek with joy as the water comes out of the tap. And then the water continues to flow down through the ravine to the next house and the next house and the next house. And each time the family squeals with delight as the water comes out. And the reason for this reaction is the mother who had to fetch water from the river her entire life, just like her mother and her grandmother, now no longer needs to be treated like a beast of burden. She no longer needs to make the unimaginable decision of which of her daughters will fetch water and which will be able to go to school. I remember when Gavina explained this to me and the anger that was in her voice, because you see, she knew these young ladies. She helped bring them into the world. She knew how smart they were. She knew what potential they had. And if they only were allowed to go to school to realize that potential, they could grow up to be teachers or nurses or other professions to contribute to society instead of to be forced to a duty similar to a beast of burden. The project continued to be challenged after it was completed. This is a picture from Hurricane Agatha in 2010, when a landslide blocked the Rio Motagua upstream And after the water overtopped that earthen dam and broke, a wave of water about 35 feet high rushed over 300 miles all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It took out everything in its path, every bridge, except, you guessed it, one. And the title on this particular newspaper article is The Unbeatable Bridge. I'd seen this when I was down doing disaster response work in another area, and was amazed that the bridge survived. And the one thing that I've learned over the years is that I think bridge stories are maybe even taller than fishing stories. And to this day, I still get questions from the community asking about what was done to the bridge that allowed it to survive. Rumors are running rampant, and they include things like a special Mayan ceremony that blessed the bridge. Or one of my favorite was when they said that the rumor was that we'd mix bull's blood with the concrete to make it stronger. Of course, in the end, I always have to admit, it was just pure dumb luck. You know, as a civil engineer, it's not very often that we get a chance to go back and review the true impact of your work 10 years after completion. And that's the fortunate assignment that I was able to be on 2 years ago when we visited the community and did a deep dive impact evaluation. What we found was that after the barriers were removed, the community took charge of its future. They formed health committees that included the school and the new clinic. They formed advocacy groups to keep an eye on the most vulnerable and even accompany them to the hospital if needed, as many of them had never left the community before. Gavina and the midwives reinforced the health and hygiene training done to the children and the adults in the evenings with each and every one of their home visits to make sure folks didn't slide back into old habits. The water community was diligent to make sure that people paid their water bills and made sure that the system was always functioning. You know, Don Mike had a phrase about water systems. He said that it really comes down to 3 very simple questions that have difficult answers. How do you generate a water bill? How do you collect the water bill? And what do you do if someone doesn't pay, especially if that person's your grandmother? These are real life sustainable issues that present communities around the globe every day. And what they lead to, in far too many times, what we call the wash death spiral. Whereas some people stop paying their water bill, which allows for less resources for maintenance. And as service declines because of lack of maintenance, more people reject their water bill. And this continues until the system completely collapses. This community realized that and was diligent and made sure that people understood the connection between their water bill and sustainable water. And at the point in time when we did the impact analysis, 98% of all the taps were flowing on those particular days. And 100% of the people had paid their water bill within the last 6 months, which was pretty incredible. The overall results on the community's health, amazing. The project and the community had completely eliminated maternal and infant mortality. School absences were reduced from 300 per month to just 2. Now, more girls were attending school instead of fetching water and firewood. Once these barriers were removed, the community simply broke free. And this is where engineering service speaks to having real impact. It removes the barriers that the communities have to realize their dreams and allows them to take charge of their future. Now, let's fast forward to COVID-19. Rotary and Engineers Without Borders has a program to help the hospitals prepare for the surge and manufacture personal protective equipment in Guatemala for the healthcare workers. You see, we realized that there was going to be the supply chain challenges that we even see in the United States, and worked with manufacturers so that they could pivot their work to make PPE for healthcare facilities down there. But I was especially worried about the midwives. You see, all of them are vulnerable ages, and I knew that they would not abandon their patients. As Gavina says, babies won't stop for the virus. And I knew that her dedication would not stop as well. So I ask you tonight, when you go home, hit your knees and say a prayer for the protection for all the healthcare workers around the planet. And Gavina, interestingly enough, is just as worried about us as we are about her. She's seen about all the news reports about how Guatemala or how the United States has been ravaged by COVID-19. And she worries about all of us up here in our health and safety. And so because of that, she sent this little video showing us how to wash our hands. All of these stories are documented in a book that I was able to write. It's called Bridging Barriers. All of the proceeds go to the Guatemala program, and Michigan Tech has a program in Guatemala as well, with the student chapter. The book can be bought on Amazon. It's $2.99 for the ebook and $14.95 for a paperback. So with that, I wanted to leave a bunch of time for questions. So see if, will we take the questions through a chat, or should we just ask people to ask their question as they see fit?
I think either way, anybody wants to do it. And I saw Dave Watkins is listed on the participant list. He could talk about the EWB program at Michigan Tech, maybe if he wants to, and what projects we might be doing this year and that kind of thing, or anybody could chime in. So anybody have any questions or comments?
This is John Gerke. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Right. So you had mentioned at the start the scarcity of groundwater resources because of the fault. I was just wondering what other information do you have about that? I'm not very familiar with that part of Guatemala and the aquifer groundwater resources there.
Yeah, so our groundwater that we're able to access, it's going to be fractured igneous rock. So we're trying to hit a fractured surface down subterranean to hit clean water. Generally, we're able to get that somewhere down around maybe 600 to 800 feet deep. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that it requires significant energy and cost to pump that water up if you are able to be lucky enough to hit one of those seams. And so there's many projects in the area that I've been called in to take a look at where they've got a successful well, but they haven't been able to sustain the project beyond a couple of years because it can be costing them as much as 30%, almost a third of their entire incomes to provide the diesel that's needed to run the generator sets. So it's one thing to be able to get a borehole that strikes the aquifer, and then it's a second challenge to be able to effectively and efficiently pump the water from that depth up for the community use. And you can see with the steep terrain, it's difficult for us to use solar because down in the valleys, it might take quite a while for the sun to even strike solar panels. And then of course, we're talking about large pumping systems that are going to need to pump water from that depth. So it does provide quite a bit of challenges. That's one of the reasons why springs are so precious and high demand in the region, because spring water is just such more of a sustainable solution. But that's a great question. Other questions? Dave, you want to talk a little bit about MTU's EWB program?
Sure. For those who don't know, thanks, Mike. That's really a great talk, and I'm really enjoying the book. I haven't made it to the end yet, but it's keeping me up at night with my interest. Yeah, so the student chapter at Michigan Tech, and I know there's a couple students on the meeting here too, has been working with two communities in Guatemala, rural Guatemala, up near the Mexican border for about 15 years now, actually. And over the years, they've helped these communities install some hand-dug wells, 2 wells in each community. They've had some challenges. They were pretty deep in terms of hand-dug wells, about 30 feet deep. And there's a limit to how far you can dig below the water table without having another pump to keep it dewatered. So basically these wells just weren't able to be dug deep enough to really provide water through the dry seasons there. And so the next alternative that we're looking at and students are working on design is a gravity fed system from a spring. And so the good news is we think there's sufficient water for one of the 2 communities, which is at the lower elevation from the spring, but it still won't solve all of their water needs. So it's kind of just a continual process. Actually, another organization came in and gave them rainwater tanks. So they sort of have a good water supply for part of the year, but it's the dry season that is a real challenge. And so the students keep working with the community to try to expand their water resources for that dry season.
And Dave, I think if I remember right, the community is actually is made up of displaced people from the war. So it's kind of a unique challenge from that standpoint of just working with the community as well, right?
It is, yeah. It's a refugee community that came back from Mexico in 1996 when the Civil War ended. And they initially were one community, and then maybe because of, you mentioned the different languages that they kind of divided themselves up into 2 communities, but they generally collaborate pretty well most of the time. And so we've always tried to work with both of them sort of equally, although now we're recognizing there's just physical differences, topographical differences in terms of the spring being able to supply water. So the students are looking at one design. The good news is the upper community actually has been able to maintain their wells reasonably well. Another issue is when the hand pumps break and then they can't get the parts, the replacement parts. That's been a mechanical issue over the years as well. But the upper community has done a pretty good job, I think, of staying organized and being able to collect funds for replacement parts when needed. So their 2 wells are functional year round.
And I think MTU also has a program outside of Guatemala as well, right, Dave?
Oh, yep. There's another one in Bolivia, eastern Bolivia, outside of Santa Cruz. And the students there have designed some improvements to road. It's basically road drainage is the issue. When they get heavy rains, things just wash out, and that kind of cuts off access from a small community there. So that project's kind of just kicking off. They submitted. The other thing that happened, right, is these were in various stages of advancing in the spring when everything shut down. And so we're gonna try to gear up again and make plans for 2021. But that project in Bolivia, they had completed the assessment trip, and we're working on the designs when things shut down with COVID-19. So.
Yeah, we're all learning how we can do our best to implement and learn remotely, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mike how you learned the language to be able to communicate with the people.
Well, the good news is that Spanish is their second language as well, right? So because of that, they're my kind of people in the sense that they speak Spanish very slowly and they have a limited vocabulary. So I do okay in Spanish in that area. I have not taken on the challenge to learn Quetzal or Quiche. There's actually 23 different Mayan languages that are separate and distinct enough that they can't even understand each other. So I've sadly put that in the bucket of things that's too hard for me to learn, and just focused on on a little bit of English and helping out with my Spanish.
Any of the students have any comments or questions?
Sure, I do. Yeah. Let's go. I'll show my video here in a second. Hi, how's it going, Mike? My name is Brian. I'm a grad student here at MTU. So I saw you talked a little bit about some of the maintenance and evaluation projects, or well, trip that you did. Was it 8 years, 10 years afterwards, which is it's a good sustainable practice. But it makes me wonder, how else is that sustainability, driven in a grassroots manner at the community level, for the community? And in a way, how is sustainability seen in a holistic approach to a project where where the community is not incentivized to depend on noble actors from organizations like Engineers Without Borders or the Peace Corps or whatever it may be, from the global north. Were there investments into the cost of the infrastructure at the beginning of the project? Are there continuing education initiatives to make sure that the operators of the water system are doing maintenance and can pass that knowledge on to the next managers and beneficiaries of the system? As well as, are there political agreements with the regional governments to maintain some of the infrastructure when Engineers Without Borders can't come back down to Guatemala to replace a broken tube or afford something that the community might not be able to? Or you said earlier too that Guatemala has quite a bit. I mean, it's not the only broken water system in Guatemala. So are there, that it's indicative of kind of an institutional problem? So other ways of starting with a project, a sustainable project, and kind of fluttering that up from there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian, and that's really the crux of development work, right? And what it comes down to is ownership. And I think honestly, I've taken some of these things and applied it to my work here in the United States as well. It's easy for us to generally easy to get the funds necessary for construction, implementation, if you will. Here in the US, it's another whole story to be able to come up with funds for maintenance. For example, the federal government doesn't pay for maintenance on transportation systems. So freeways get built, but it's up to the states and local government to maintain those. So to have that willingness and acceptance by local government and state government to maintain those systems is really important. And that's, of course, very important here in this context as well. So from the very, one of the blessings we had here, Brian, was that there wasn't a lot of NGO dependence in this area. They hadn't worked with other NGOs. So their expectation wasn't that this was going to be a continuous handout. And we were able to reinforce with them that we would help and work with them on the initial construction, but after that, they were going to need to implement it themselves. And I remember that after Hurricane Agatha, had then finally gotten to visit the community because I knew that there had been quite a bit of damage done in that area. And when I got there, I was so pleased to see that all the repairs had been done. They weren't necessarily done the way I would have done them as an engineer, but they were all completed, right? And they were done by the community themselves. They had pulled together the resources themselves to be able to do the work. And we went to the community committee and just said how proud we were that they did all this work themselves. And frankly, Brian, they were a little bit insulted because they said, hey, you told us that you would help us build it. And after that, we had to maintain it. So we just kind of held up our end of the bargain. And so that's when I knew that we really had, done our job on conveying that ownership part of it. But you're so true, so right that, challenges occur to these systems long-term. And I think that's one of the major lessons that I learned is that, it's easy to put together a sustainable system in place for a couple of years, but then life happens, right? There might be a drought that challenges the community and now their income is low. And so because of that, people can't pay their maintenance fee, right? I think all of us would realize that, we're probably going to spend our money on medicine for our family versus maybe on our water bill, right? So these things are cyclical, and it's during these times of stress that really challenge the sustainability. And I think this is where it was good to be able to have a continued connection with the community, not so much from a financial standpoint, but to be able to provide this voice of a third party unbiased person, right? So there would, especially early on, we'd be called in to maybe a couple of times a year, attend a water committee meeting. And at that time, really what it was is to provide some backing, validation of what the water committee was asking the community to do. If it was, hey, we're going to have a policy in place that if you don't pay your bill after 3 months, we're going to turn off the water or something to that effect. And because these are political positions and they're difficult, right? Because everything is interconnected. If you're on the water committee, Brian, maybe I'm walking my sheep through your yard to be able to get to green pastures, right? So there's always other relationships that are involved with this that makes it complex. So to have an unbiased third party to be able to come in and provide advice that has some credibility within the community, I think was important. And it was interesting you mentioned politics. One of the biggest challenges we had to the project was that some years after the project was completed, the local government, in essence, it would be the county executive, a new person ran and got elected on a platform that no water could be turned off to a family. Well, it's very popular I'm sure it got him a lot of votes, but it sure is crummy for sustainability, right? Because no one now wants to pay for their water bill. And if no one's paying their water bill, who's going to pay for the maintenance guy? Who's going to pay for the pipes? All of those things. And we're seeing a lot of that, frankly, right now around the globe. So right now I'm serving as a senior technical advisor to the United Nations for COVID-19. And we see a lot of governments, particularly in Africa, who have made it illegal to turn off water to residential facilities, and basically edicting that water is going to be free. But we all know that clean water is not free, right? I mean, it takes some resource to pump it, to clean it, all of those kinds of things. And so, especially in countries like Uganda and Ghana and elsewhere, we're seeing some real challenges to the sustainability of water systems throughout the whole country because of this notion of politics. So it always does seem to be something that crops up and challenges the sustainability, even years and years after the systems have been put in place.
Yeah, it is. The sustainability isn't perfect, and yeah, it's certainly messy, as I think anyone who's worked with the development organization has found out. So thank you for answering. Appreciate it.
We're kind of out of time, but Mike, do you want to tell us how we could get your book if we wanted to, like how it's available?
Sure. Well, there's 2 ways. One, you can go on Amazon and you can get an ebook, or you can get the paperback. But hopefully here in another month or so, if you can wait a little bit, the goal is that the MTU EWB chapter is going to be having some of them available. And that way, I'll be donating the books to the chapter, and the chapter will get all of the proceeds from the book for their projects in Guatemala, which I think would be absolutely amazing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, great. I'm going to cut it off since it's 10 till, and I thank everybody for coming, and keep looking for announcements for future seminars. So
Hey, Brian,
thanks, everybody.
Brian, before you shut off, this is Eric Segrin here. If anybody would like documentation of attendance to the seminar for their PE continuing education credit requirements, please send me an email and I'll send you the documentation.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that.
Thank you.